and thank you for putting for them. All right, got it. Okay, so we'll start again. I just wanted to, since I did want to acknowledge, we're not going to be talking so much about the atrocities and what we've been seeing. I'm sure people have been hearing a lot about that. The urgency for today is what can we do to respond? So that's what we're really going to be focusing on. And I'm trying my best to, always hone my own Marxist thinking from a working class perspective, a revolutionary perspective too. And so our task today is to really cut through what we hear in the mainstream press, and even what some of the left says. What do we really think is the most appropriate analysis of the situation? I want to begin with a brief history of Ukraine, going back it's been there for a long time, but just going back a couple centuries. Ukraine was occupied by Tsarist Russia, and part of it was occupied by Poland until the early 20th century. It overcame that occupation in the upsurge of the workers' revolutionary movement in the time of the Russian Revolution. And it was, in fact, first it formed as an independent Ukrainian People's Republic, and then 3 years later, it was one of the founding republics of the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, as people I'm sure know, there were years of economic recession as all the new capitalists came forward to fight over the spoils. Since then, there's been a competition between pro-Russian forces, those who want Ukraine to be independent, and those who are more aligned with the United States and the West. So it essentially became huge superpower, and the Ukrainian poor and working class majority are pawns in the struggle. Some of those who wanted to maintain Ukraine's national identity and autonomy, some of them are neo-fascists, and some, on the other hand, are fighting to maintain just a genuine Ukrainian identity. So this is an important thing to look at again through a Marxist working class lens. They're not all nationalists in the way that we've come to understand that term at this stage in the United States, where it means xenophobia, it means white supremacy, it means a lot of very racist and homophobic and sexist things. So people are coming at this from a lot of different perspectives. However, in many places on the planet, just as in many places, here in Ukraine that we're talking about, there are neo-fascists who are organizing, and they're also in the government in Ukraine. But it's not a fascist state. We hear, things about denazifying or denazification that Putin's also trying to claim he's trying to do. I'll say a little bit more about that. Still, Ukraine's government, although it's not a fascist state, the government and Zelensky at the helm is no friend to working class or Ukrainians. There has been and continues with Zelensky corruption, structural adjustments and debt, the living standard is plummeting, and there's privatization. Putin's claims also, something to respond to, Putin's claims that Ukraine is historically part of Russia. That's very backward from a working class perspective. Ukraine joined the Soviet Union when the world's first worker state was established. Prior to that, Ukraine was occupied by Tsarist Russia. And so imperial occupation for the benefit of the aggressor, that's hardly the same thing as upholding the culture and character of a nation. And this is something that Lenin established right at the outset of the revolution, that the ethnic minorities of smaller nations to maintain their languages and customs. And so this applied to Ukraine as part of the Soviet Union, even as it also belonged to a larger union of Soviet republics. A little more on Ukraine. It's the poorest country in Europe in spite of very rich oil and gas reserves. Its wealth is concentrated in a few hands. Its resources and markets are being fought over by Putin, by the United States / NATO juggernaut, which I'll say a little more about. China, lots of Western European countries also have their sights set on Ukraine's resources. Up to modern times, in 2004, the Ukraine elections spurred the Orange Revolution when pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych claimed victory, but there was found to be electoral fraud, which resulted in mass protests, which was great. The goal was to remove him, and it did, and it ushered in Viktor Yushchenko. But unfortunately, that was only a slightly kinder, gentler form of capitalism, and he was basically a Western reformer. against the evil Russia. Another chance to think as a Marxist. Of course, during the Cold War, we heard, Russia being demonized in the U.S. press because it was an ideological difference between socialism and capitalism. Well, that demonizing is still happening today because it's still pretending that the press still pretends that it's a worker state. It's been capitalist since 1991, so you can't blame communism now for imperialist expansion. Conditions were not much better in the next years, and in 2010, actually won the election again, only to be ousted again in 2014 in the really famous Euromaidan protests. All of this points to people's desperation for change that's been going on for a long time in Ukraine. Just as in the U.S., how can we possibly explain Trump being elected? Elections bounce back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. Here in Ukraine, they bounce back and forth between two parties that ultimately offer no hope. So the United States got Arseniy Yatsenyuk installed, who was a Putin foe and importantly very U.S. friendly, and he wanted full privatization of all state property, and that's neoliberal to the core, just like Zelensky today. So again, a little bit on the history I think it's worth talking about. Now we're talking about outside of the region, other players in the struggle. The backdrop, this is getting out there. People have a good sense of it, but understanding it is really important. The United States and NATO have been building up a military presence in Eastern Europe, especially on the Ukraine-Russia border, for 10 plus years. The United States was the dominant force in the world at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. But now, of course, its domination is being challenged, and so it's meeting that challenge with a military presence. NATO itself is it's no independent or some umbrella peacekeeping force. The NATO commander is a United States Air Force general with a multinational 40,000 strong NATO response force reporting to him. It's a formation of the ruling class for ruling class interests. It's a bourgeois formation. So it's not there to end suffering for poor and working people. And we only have to remember that NATO supported the U.S. war in Afghanistan. So the question of joining or not joining NATO is probably part of Ukrainian struggles right now. But joining or not joining, or whether to support the NATO side or a non-NATO side, it doesn't get to the heart of who's right or wrong, but it's really which imperialists are you going to align with? What capitalist camp are you trying to be in? Russia, the U.S., or another striving imperial power? A little more on the role of the United States in creating the crisis. I know it's gotten a little press of late. The United States helped to train the Azov Battalion, which had some open fascists in the lead. I mean, it was open. And they were then given high-level cabinet posts. The U.S., so that's one thing. The United States also handpicked Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who I just mentioned. So the United States is stirring all this up and making neo-fascism now an internal threat to the Ukrainians besides the United States itself and Russian threats. It's important to say, of course, that in a world that's dominated by a few imperialist powers, the devastation that we're seeing so clearly in Ukraine is happening across the globe. The U.S. is there, and this is by no means the only hotspot that deserves our international working class attention. But we'll focus on Ukraine today. Exactly why is this happening? Why now? Ukraine has a lot of resources, as I mentioned, and so controlling Ukraine helps to control Eastern Europe as a whole. In this era of capitalist globalization, there's been a massive transfer of wealth from neo-colonial countries to the big powers. With the world now in the late stage capitalism, as Andy referred to, in an economic crisis, the major players have to now attack each other to steal resources and markets. This is going to be the scenario. That is, unless we unite around the world to change the rules of the game from capitalism and private property to socialism. Capitalism is so unstable and so unsustainable that these inter-imperial conflicts will only intensify. Because again, everywhere's been conquered by one capitalist power, and I put that in quotes, and I say that, not supporting the conquering, but everywhere has been conquered by one capitalist power or another. Again, this is late stage capitalism, and the book that Andy mentioned, imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. That is the logical result of the tightening of private property and the private market. There are no more markets to expand to, and quite literally, socialism is the remedy. Sharing the resources, redistributing the wealth, removing profit and inequalities. Another factor that we just can never lose sight of, economies like the United States and Russia, China, they rely on military spending, regardless of where it's directed. It's not so important what the issues are or who's fighting, but the guns bring money, and that's the bold, honest truth. So U.S., Russia, they're seeking to gain imperialist ground. Just as the U.S. sees Israel as its own Middle East outpost to control the oil there, that's how countries are fighting over Ukraine as an outpost to control what's around. So is it really about a choice so simple between Putin or Zelensky? Well, I'm going to say no, but it's a false choice. I mean, Putin is horrid. Talking about what Putin is doing in Russia, emboldening and collaborating with neo-fascists. He's criminalized homosexuality. People are being executed or imprisoned if they disagree with him. No free election, no freedom for labor. And not to mention, violent oppression against ethnic minorities. If that's the kind of denazification he's trying to sell, it's not looking too good. But none of that, what Putin is doing, makes Zelensky a hero. We've got to really grapple with that. Besides the neoliberal policies that he's already enacted, leading to poverty and more of it, rather than combating it. Now, just in the last little bit, we've seen him introduce martial law against Ukrainians, crack down on political parties, including the left and those who at least lean toward anti-capitalist, anti-imperial policies, and he's consolidated state TV. Plus, he's been pushing privatization and measures to enrich the ruling elite. So Ukraine and Zelensky are resisting Putin's attacks. That's about Ukrainian sovereignty, and that's fair. No country has the right to just start bombing another country. We don't want to condone that. But this is also about much more than just sovereignty. The Ukrainian people need self-determination and the ability to survive and overcome the crippling poverty that they face. Zelensky's privatization, profits for billionaires, is not going to bring that. There are leftist socialists that they pretty much don't hold any electoral sway anymore. And unfortunately, they're pretty reformist and ultimately just trying to make capitalism, again, a little bit kinder. And it's not, they don't endeavor, they don't set out to actually make fundamental change for Ukrainians. But they are calling for some important things like canceling the debt, popularizing healthcare programs, winning strong labor protections. Some left also criticizing the Western left for apologizing too much for Putin and blaming it all only on the United States. I think it's really important to think about. It's a crucial concept. Again, countries should say to other countries, but leaving our analysis there would be at odds with defending the needs of millions of Ukrainians fleeing the bombs or joining the resistance. They have to resist the deadly attacks coming from Russia. But will defeating Putin's military ultimately change their lives when they were already suffering greatly before February 24th? What about the spiraling economy and all the other imperialist nations with their sights looking to move into Ukraine? What about NATO? What about the United States? So Putin is invading a sovereign country. That is something we should condemn. Ukrainians are resisting as valiantly as they can, and a lot of Russian soldiers are very demoralized because they didn't feel that they were even told the truth about what their mission was to be. But the resistance has to go beyond fighting to preserve Ukraine as it was before the invasion. So ideally, their resistance doesn't end at opposing Putin, because a blind loyalty to Zelensky or Ukraine the nation won't liberate them. They deserve self-determination and they have a right to it. But capitalism can't provide it. Sovereignty and self-determination really are two different concepts, and I think they're getting really muddled in our U.S. press. But the big difference is based on class and who is determining what. So self-determination is determined by Zelensky and the ruling class is not genuine self-determination for the majority of Ukrainians. And again, that kind of self-determination can't be provided by capitalism. Here, we have to acknowledge that there are those who are even more hard-hit than what we're seeing. There are immigrants, especially African immigrants in Ukraine, queers, the Roma population. They can't afford to go back to business as usual, much as most Ukrainians can't, but they less than anyone. They were especially devastated before the attacks came. Now they're additionally facing longer checkpoints at the borders than native Ukrainians. Reports of violence against them are everywhere, even when they make it to the checkpoints. So imagine if the fighters who are mobilized at this moment, who are fighting on the front lines, imagine if they could reach a civil war and actually create a revolution to return the corruption and abuse tormenting everyday Ukrainians. They continue to fight it. They change the targets, the class that's exploiting. This is a concept called revolutionary defeatism that was put forward by Lenin. And I'll say a little more in a moment. Our role in building up and leading an anti-capitalist, socialist, militant movement here in the United States and defending just such a turn in Ukraine and in Russia, it cannot be understated that that is our job. We are pressure we put anywhere on the U.S. war machine is paramount. I want to explain really carefully what Lenin meant by revolutionary defeatism. And in his own words, defeat is the lesser evil, but that does not mean defeat of one's country is the lesser evil as compared with the defeat of the enemy country, but that a military defeat that results from the growth of the revolutionary movement is infinitely more beneficial to the proletariat and to the whole people than military victory assured by a civil peace. How long would that even last? Trotsky recognized that there was no, Trotsky now, not Lenin, there was no line of demarcation between working class policy in a time of war or in a time of peace. His point, which I agree with, is that we have to insist that, he insisted that defeatism was simply the extension to wartime and peacetime. Proletariat of the working class's irreconcilable hostility to the ruling class. To carry the class struggle to its highest form, civil war is the task of defeatism. So it's a tricky word, but revolutionary defeatism. This is a task that can only be solved through the revolutionary mobilization of the masses, that is by widening, deepening, and sharpening those revolutionary methods which constitute the content of class struggle in peacetime. So that's our job. That's our job here. And yes, if we're to be taken up by the fighters in Ukraine and in Russia, that they're holding the guns already and they just need to aim. I don't mean just, I'm not minimizing, but they need to aim them at the actual enemy. So to end, what's our role as the working class in the United States? Of course, we have to call out our own government and the media and its lies and distortions that whitewash the United States responsibility. Absolutely. Likewise, we have to be equally clear that Putin is no friend and no victim. We have to oppose a violation of sovereignty without supporting a capitalist leader who is no friend to his own populace. This requires precision and nuance in our slogans and it demands, and in our slogans and demands, and how we strive to frame this issue. So we have to look at what others are saying and debate. Others on the left, I think, get some of it right, but miss the mark from the class perspective. The Party for Socialism and Liberation, we see out here in the Bay Area, we need to talk to them. They really actually say that Nazis are the focus, and this is about denazification. Some see Russia as worthy of defending as even a former worker state. I disagree. The Freedom Socialist Party disagrees. International Action Center and Workers' World Party do actually call for resolving the conflict through the United Nations. Again, that's a bourgeois institution, and it will have a ruling class solution, and it won't be peace. Democratic Socialists of America, maybe you've seen some articles of late. They got called out by the Democrats because they were so strongly condemning the United States. They do condemn U.S. imperialism, and they call for the U.S. to exit NATO and encourage us to call on our governments to accept refugees. That's good. But they fail in saying that they call for a diplomatic solution. The diplomatic bodies are ruling class bodies. So this crisis, just like ever more crises, needs the absence of capitalism. And the only thing that we've come up with as humanity so far to fill that void is socialism. Other tasks, we have to defend and publicize anti-war activism that's happening in Russia and globally. Feminist anti-war resistance has been out there calling for solidarity. And they know, and we know, that women are key to this struggle in every anti-war movement on the planet. Socialists Against the War, an open socialist denouncing Putin and his war within Russia, deserve our support. And again, anything we can do as a movement that points to capitalism's inability to ever work for the world's majority is critical at this time. Attending anti-war actions is imperative in raising these anti-capitalist demands, but also fighting against austerity measures right here in San Francisco at City College, or joining the struggle to save and expand reproductive justice are also part of this fight if we make the connection to our whole worldwide class. Just because we live within a superpower, an imperialist superpower, it doesn't mean we're reaping the benefits. We may not have it as bad as Ukraine right at this moment, but we are losing ground quickly in the United States, and many have no ground at all. Building a socialist feminist revolutionary party, I'm happy to say, could not be a more urgent task with inclusive internationalist demands, and we are seeking the leadership of people who have the most to gain from fundamental revolutionary change. That's who needs to be in the leadership of these movements, and that's what the Freedom Socialist Party stands for. We truly need to push for these demands here in a vibrant U.S. socialist movement now. The demands that the Freedom Socialist Party is putting out, they're big. Russian and U.S. hands off of Ukraine. Close down U.S. military bases abroad and bring the troops home. Disband NATO. No workers' blood for imperialist oil. Solidarity with Russian anti-war protesters for a socialist United States of New York. It had to happen somewhere. For a united socialist United States of Europe, that is very odd, but a comic relief moment, and open the borders for all refugees. If we don't fight these demands and more, we certainly will not achieve them. It's coming down to that. We don't state the immensity, but also the urgency of the task to immediately end the suffering of the impoverished, threatened people. We surely know we will indeed not end that suffering for our own. War, environmental destruction, climate change, police brutality, and more are in our future. As our eyes are drawn to Eastern Europe right in this moment, it is a moment we can draw on the gains of the Russian Revolution and imagine an international effort to free all of us and eliminate foreign imperialism. We head toward planetary destruction or where the laborers and creators are finally at the helm. That's the bold and necessary task that we in the Freedom Socialist Party set out to do today, and we urge everyone to join us.